Hello, my name is Ken Zanzalari, and I'm Animate Product Manager for Phibro Animal Health Corporation. And today I'm going to review a couple key principles when feeding a negative DCAD diet to prepartum dairy cows. When you think about using negative DCAD diets prepartum, many different ideas and concepts come to mind. And that's because there's a lack of understanding of the research that's been conducted in this area. When you think about hypocalcemia is a significant herd health issue in our dairy industry, but there's many misconceptions about the proper way to feed and manage dairy cows prepartum for optimal calcium metabolism. And that's influenced by the lack of understanding of research that's been conducted in the area, and the negative impact that hypocalcemia has been minimized by the misunderstanding between the two major forms, which is clinical and subclinical hypocalcemia. And you first need to distinguish between both of those, because the approach to feeding and management to eliminate or reduce either one is different. And it has been an overlooked disorder, and the consequences of which have led to reduced dairy farm profitability. This is a diagram that illustrates very simply calcium metabolism within the dairy cow. And I'm going to review a couple key principles with regards to bone calcium resorption, dietary calcium uptake by the gut tissue, and the role of kidney in the control of calcium, particularly prepartum. And I'm going to talk about the key nutrients that are involved and influence each one of these pathways. Bone calcium storage. Calcium is stored primarily in two states within bone. And as you know, bone is the largest source of calcium reserves for the dairy cow. It's been estimated that upwards of 15% of her bone calcium will be released during lactation. It has been estimated that the dairy cow will resorb 15% of her bone calcium throughout lactation to meet the demands for calcium. I'm going to first review with you the importance of bone calcium storage and its role in maintaining and meeting the requirements for calcium during lactation. As you may know, the bone is the major storage site for calcium. It is also the major storage site for phosphorus and magnesium, two other key nutrients that need to be met in order to produce high levels of milk production. Calcium is stored in the bone in the form of hydroxyapatite, a very strong molecule that leads to bone strength, and when called upon can be recruited to deliver calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium to the needs of production. It's estimated that about 6 to 10 grams of calcium is stored in bone. There is another important part of bone structure that contains calcium as well. And this calcium is more readily available to meet the demands of calcium, particularly during the initiation of lactation. So while calcium that is stored in bone takes several days to be recruited, calcium in this mobile pool is recruited within hours. So both of these are very important. Another major source of calcium, particularly during very early lactation and then throughout lactation, is the calcium that the cow absorbs through her diet. There are two main absorption routes for calcium. One is active transport. That is the vitamin D dependent mechanism that takes dietary calcium through active transport, which is an energy requiring step, to meet the demands for not only the high demand for calcium in early lactation, but the high demand for calcium throughout the entire lactation period. And as I just mentioned, this is a vitamin D dependent mechanism. The other mechanism, which most people tend to forget about, but is equally or even more important than active transport, is what we call paracellular calcium uptake, or passive transport. And passive transport becomes very important as we feed higher levels of dietary calcium. Several studies have indicated that when high dietary levels of calcium are fed, the passive transport system delivers more calcium into the system of the cow than even the active transport system. So utilizing this as a strategy can be very helpful in meeting the needs of high calcium demand, particularly during early lactation, and some may believe even prepartum. I'm going to use this diagram to illustrate a few key points with regards to calcium metabolism during early lactation. The graph that you are looking at now is from work presented by Dr. Charles Ramberg from the University of Pennsylvania Vet School. And this diagram depicts the time points in which these individual events occur. So if we look at the middle line, you'll notice that there is a dip in calcium 3 to 4 days postpartum. That is a natural occurrence, and irrespective of whether you feed a negative DCAD diet prepartum or a non-acidified diet, all cows go through this transient depression of calcium in early lactation. If you look to the line on the bottom of the chart, or immediately below the calcium line, that line depicts the importance of bone calcium with regards to supplying the needed amount of calcium for lactation. And what you will notice, the supply of calcium that is derived from bone does not start to occur until 10 days to 2 weeks or longer into lactation, which indicates to us that in order to meet the high demand for calcium, particularly within the first week of lactation, and even more so within the first 2 to 3 days of lactation, that calcium demand needs to be met by dietary sources, both coming from the active transport mechanism and the passive transport mechanism. So utilizing both of those is important to meet the needs of early lactation calcium demand. There's been several methods that have been researched looking at the effectiveness of maintaining calcium status in early lactation cows. There's been much work done looking at the levels of potassium in diets. And as you know or may know, it is the amount of potassium that the dairy cow consumes that has the biggest impact, the biggest negative impact on calcium status because of its alteration of acid-base balance. So a strategy, regardless of whether you're going to use a non-acidified diet or a negative DCAD diet prepartum, is to start by reducing the potassium load that these cows receive through their diet. There's been a lot of work also investigating the effects of dietary calcium on hypocalcemia as well. And what we found through several good papers is that in order for calcium or dietary calcium to affect calcium metabolism of the prepartum and postpartum dairy cow, you need to feed very, very low levels of calcium, less than 20 or 30 grams, and more specifically, less than 10 grams. It is very difficult to accomplish this strategy in the type of diets that we feed today's dairy cows. Another strategy that's been investigated is the use of injectable vitamin D. And while this strategy can be effective, it is very difficult to implement in our normal practices on dairy farms. And that's why the dairy industry relies upon the use of negative DCAD diets prepartum in order to accomplish this goal of optimizing calcium metabolism. I'm going to use this table from some work that was published in 1974 that will illustrate the role of calcium and its effect on milk fever or clinical hypocalcemia. Because I want to distinguish between the two forms and the strategies that can be used to either reduce or eliminate clinical milk fever from subclinical hypocalcemia. In this study, they fed a controlled diet in which 41 grams of calcium was fed prepartum and the treatment diet consisted of 8 grams of calcium. What you will notice, if you look at the numbers going from left to right, you'll notice that 5 of the cows that were fed the control diet had clinical milk fever, while none of the animals fed the treatment diet of 8 grams of calcium prepartum had clinical milk fever. So the strategy of feeding lower levels of prepartum calcium had a significant effect on the incident rate of clinical milk fever. Now let's look at the number of subclinical hypocalcemia cases in animals fed the 2 respective diets. What you will notice is that if you look at the columns, the second and third column from the right, and add those 2 values together, that will give you the total number of cows that had subclinical hypocalcemia. And you will notice that there is no difference between the 2 diets. So while feeding lower levels of calcium was effective in altering the incident rate of clinical milk fever, both diets had similar effects on subclinical hypocalcemia, that being very little effect. So a strategy of low dietary calcium may be good to reduce clinical milk fever, but is not a very good strategy when you're trying to reduce subclinical hypocalcemia. I'm going to use this chart from a study going back to 1975 in which they looked at calcium balance within cows fed 2 different strategies of DCAD and 2 levels of dietary calcium. In this study, cows were fed either 2 levels of calcium, low and high. The low dietary calcium was 0.2% of the diet dry matter. The high calcium diet delivered 2.1% calcium on a dry matter basis. And then cows were fed either a non-acidified diet or an acidified diet prepartum. And what you'll notice from this slide, and highlighted in yellow, is that cows fed the high level of dietary calcium along with the low level of DCAD or negative DCAD diet had the higher calcium balance of all cows, which indicates to us that a strategy of low DCAD and high calcium is the most effective strategy for increasing calcium retention within the dairy cow. Another way to look at this data from the same experiment is illustrated in this table here. And these data are summarized for just calcium level treatments. So on the left side of the chart are values that depict the calcium retention of cows fed the low calcium diet, and again, prepartum, that diet was 0.2%. So for a 10 kilogram intake, that would equate to about 20 grams of calcium. The values on the right side of the table are the values that represent calcium balance for animals that received the high level of dietary calcium prepartum, and that diet was 2.1%. So we're looking at animals, we're looking at the effects of a very low and a very high level of prepartum dietary calcium on calcium retention. And what you will notice if you compare the numbers across days that have the same color, so in other words, if you look at the very left column at day 56 compared to day 56 for the cows fed high calcium, you will notice that each of those values for the animals fed the high dietary calcium are always significantly higher, which indicates if you feed a cow higher dietary levels of calcium, the calcium will absorb and retain more and more calcium. And that is a key point, particularly during early lactation. Because if you think back to the diagram I showed you earlier, the most susceptible time for a dairy cow to have clinical or subclinical hypocalcemia is in the first week. And these 2 charts illustrate to us that if you feed high levels of dietary calcium prepartum and through early lactation, that will be one significant source of calcium for the dairy cow. Another study to help illustrate the point that it is the effect of level of dietary DCAD and calcium that is important with regards to altering calcium metabolism in a dairy cow. In this study, cows were fed either a positive or negative DCAD diet and either a low or high dietary level of prepartum calcium. And they followed the calcium balance of these cows through day 4 of lactation. And what you will notice from this slide is that the cows fed the what you will notice from this study is that cows fed the high dietary calcium were always in a more positive calcium balance. Now that doesn't mean that their total calcium balance was positive. As an example, day 1 postpartum, the cows fed the low dietary calcium were in a negative 9 gram calcium balance. However, the cows fed the high dietary calcium day 1 in lactation were only short 2 grams of calcium. And as you look at day 2, 3, and 4, that value became more pronounced. And what is interesting, by day 2, cows fed the high dietary calcium were already back into a positive calcium balance status. Whereas through day 4, cows fed the low dietary calcium were still in a severe negative calcium balance. Another interesting point to look at in this study is that day 4, for cows fed the low dietary calcium, their calcium balance became more negative. And I believe that's indicative of the cows starting to produce significantly more milk. And as the demand for calcium to meet that higher milk production increased, her calcium status became more depressed. Conversely, if you look at the cows fed the high dietary calcium, they were in a very strong positive calcium balance. And at day 4 was 14 grams of calcium. Another study to help illustrate the effects of DCAD and dietary calcium is shown here. In this study, 3 levels of DCAD were fed. Cows were either fed a positive 15 DCAD, a 0 DCAD diet, or a negative 15 DCAD diet. And what you will notice for both urine pH, serum ionized calcium, and production of 3.5% fat-corrected milk, cows fed the more negative DCAD diet had, as we would expect, lower urine pH values, which indicates to us that the level of acidification was more and was proper. Their ionized calcium was higher, and the production of 3.5% fat-corrected milk was also significantly higher. Again, indicating that lower levels of DCAD is a more proper way and a more effective way to feed DCAD diets. I'm going to use a couple interesting studies to help illustrate another key point. And again, I'm going to use these next 2 studies to show that it is the level of DCAD and the level of dietary calcium that is important. Another study that I will utilize to help illustrate the effect of dietary DCAD and dietary calcium was a study that was conducted at the University of Wisconsin by Dr. Gary Etzel. In this study, they fed 2 levels of DCAD and 2 different levels of dietary calcium. And I want to draw your attention to the values that are contained in the red boxes. These are the incident rates of subclinical hypocalcemia between the 4 groups. And what you will notice is that cows fed the low DCAD diet along with the low level of dietary calcium had much higher incident rates of subclinical hypocalcemia, that was approximately 45%, compared to the cows that were fed the low DCAD diet and the higher level of dietary calcium. In that group of animals, the incident rate of subclinical hypocalcemia was only approximately 15%. So again, this study illustrates to us very nicely that it's the combination or the effective use of both low DCAD and higher levels of dietary calcium that have the greatest impact on subclinical hypocalcemia. Another study that I can utilize to help demonstrate this concept is a study that was conducted at the University of British Columbia, in which they used an experimental model in which EDTA is infused to chelate calcium and mimic hypocalcemia in a dairy cow. And this method of investigation is very novel because you can control the degree and the rapidity of clinical hypocalcemia. The concept behind this type of experimental model is this. EDTA is infused for a given period of time to drop serum calcium down to 50% of normal values. So you can see that the starting point for the ionized calcium status of these cows was approximately 1.2 millimolar. They infused EDTA to drop the concentration to approximately 0.7 millimolar. At that point, the infusion is stopped, and then, through measurements of blood calcium again, they follow how fast and how complete calcium status is restored. What you will notice from this graph is that the cows fed the lower level of DCAD, and in this study, that equated to a urine pH of 6.8 compared to cows fed either a diet that resulted in a urine pH of 7.1 or 7.8. What you will notice is cows that were fed the lower level of DCAD responded by replacing their calcium status in blood at a much faster rate. Again, this illustrates to us that a negative DCAD diet is very effective in recruiting the necessary means that the dairy cow has to replenish calcium back into her blood compartment. So we've just reviewed level of DCAD and dietary level of calcium and its impact on calcium status of the cow. I want to also bring out another important nutrient or mineral that is important with regards to making negative DCAD diets work more effectively. And that's the effect of dietary sulfur. We know through several good pieces of literature that dietary sulfur is an important nutrient with regards to optimizing calcium status of a cow. In a study done by Roche in 2002, they observed that cows fed higher levels of sulfur with the same level of DCAD had significantly higher plasma calcium values. And I'm going to use the next couple of slides to illustrate where and why sulfur is important and how it works in the cow. We took a look at this slide earlier, and I want to draw your attention to the lower right-hand side of the screen under urinary output. Because what I will show you here in the next several slides is the effect of sulfur on excretion of calcium through the kidney and ultimately through urine. Because in the prepartum dairy cow fed a negative DCAD diet, that is one of the most significant effects that DCAD diets have in helping the cow balance her calcium status. We're going to review some information that was presented in a paper by Dr. Jesse Goff, in which they investigated the effects and comparisons of chloride versus sulfur with its effect on acidifying urine. And what you will notice over the various levels of milliequivalents that were fed, that was either 0.75, 1.5, or 2.25, that urine pH were similar in animals that were fed equal equivalents of either chloride or sulfur. The point I want to make is that sulfur is an effective acidifying agent as chloride with regards to reducing urine pH. So why is sulfur important with regards to formulation of negative DCAD diets? Well, this slide will help us understand that a little more clearly. I mentioned just a little bit ago that sulfur has an effect at the kidney. So let's take a look at why sulfur is an important nutrient with regards to optimizing calcium status of the prepartum and postpartum dairy cow. In this study, two types of proteins were fed, and what you will notice is that as dietary intake of sulfur increases, so does the excretion of calcium through urine. You will notice that there is a dietary protein effect, meaning that various qualities and levels of protein will have a more pronounced effect on calcium excretion through the urine. But the take-home point, the significant point to take from this slide is that as levels of dietary sulfur increases, so does the level of excretion of both sulfur and calcium. If we look at another study in which they investigated level of dietary sulfur with respect to urinary calcium excretion, it tells us the same thing. As dietary intake of sulfur increases, and therefore the level of sulfur excretion through the urine increases, so does the excretion of calcium. This is a very strong relationship because you'll notice that this is a very linear effect. So as sulfur excretion through the kidney increases, so does calcium excretion. So by feeding higher dietary levels of sulfur, we can influence how many grams of calcium are excreted through the kidney. Let's look at another study in which the effect of sulfur on calcium excretion was investigated. And again, similar to what I just presented to you, this study also illustrates to us that as levels of sulfur excretion increase through urine, so does the level of calcium. So why is this important in formulation of diets prepartum? As we increase the level of dietary sodium in the prepartum diet of a dairy cow, we can influence how much of calcium is excreted. The reason that is important is as we feed negative DCAD diets prepartum, we stimulate the processes of bone resorption and dietary calcium uptake to deliver more calcium to the system of the cow. While she's still a prepartum dairy cow, her requirement for calcium is still quite low. So the body has to handle this extra calcium. And it is the kidney, through urinary excretion of calcium, that balances that equation for us. And so, by feeding higher levels of dietary sulfur, we can influence how many grams of calcium are excreted. And the more we get excreted through urine, the better, because the entry rate then of calcium into that ionizable calcium pool is increased. And that is a key concept that many people do not think about when they think about formulating diets for prepartum dairy cows. Another interesting point is that this phenomena occurs regardless of the level of calcium. You will notice that the lines, that the animals represented by the dark circles are cows that are in a positive or normal calcium status, whereas the dots in this graph that are in the open circles are for cows that have a low level of ionized calcium. And the effect of sulfur on excreting calcium has the same effect regardless of plasma calcium concentration. I'm going to use a recent study we conducted at Cornell University to help illustrate and demonstrate to you that the use of a low DCAD diet along with high dietary calcium has a positive effect on not only dry matter intake and milk yield, but also helps support the concept of dietary calcium with excretion of calcium through urine. In this study, we fed a typical Midwest diet, Northeast diet for the United States, in which a diet was comprised of corn silage and wheat hay, and the typical normal ingredients. The acidifying agent in this study was Animate. This chart just illustrates for you some of the key nutrient contents of the diet. Pay particular attention to the level of DCAD. So in this study, we had 3 levels of DCAD. The control cows had a plus 18 milliequivalents per 100 gram of dry matter. The cows fed the medium DCAD diet. They were still in a positive state. And this diet milliequivalent per 100 grams of dry matter was 5.9. And then the cows fed the low DCAD diet, and this diet was negative 7.4 milliequivalents per 100 gram. And interestingly, and one of the goals of this study was to feed the low DCAD diet that would result in urine pHs falling below 6.0. Another key point to mention in this study was that dietary level of calcium was the same for all 3 treatments. So were the levels for phosphorus and magnesium. However, higher and higher levels of sulfur were included in the diet as we fed for a lower DCAD diet, resulting in a level of 0.4% dietary sulfur for the cows that received the lowest DCAD diet. This chart illustrates the urine pHs for cows fed each of those respective diets. And as I mentioned, one of the goals in this study was to feed enough anions in our low DCAD diet that would result in urine pHs at or below 6. And the average urine pH for those cows across the 3 weeks of this prepartum study averaged 5.9. This graph illustrates the plasma calcium levels of each of those groups of animals. What you will notice is that there are similar trends among those cows. However, the cows that are depicted with the red line, those are the cows that were fed the lowest DCAD diet, maintained higher levels of serum calcium prepartum, on the day of calving, and throughout the early postpartum period. That's a normal response. That's a response that we expect as an outcome of feeding low DCAD diets. This chart illustrates to us the percentages of cows that were considered subclinical hypocalcemic cows according to time post-calving. Our definition of subclinical hypocalcemia were any animals that had serum calcium concentrations below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. I will use this chart to illustrate a couple key points. 1, regardless of dietary DCAD prepartum, the serum calcium status of cows in the very early lactation. I will use this graph from this study to illustrate to you a couple of key points with regards to serum calcium status of postpartum dairy cows. 1, the level of hypocalcemia in each of the 3 groups of animals that were fed the various levels of DCAD were similar in the very early postpartum period. Subclinical hypocalcemia was defined as animals that had serum calcium concentrations less than 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. You will notice at the first time point measured that animals fed each of those diets had very high prevalence rates of subclinical hypocalcemia. By the second time point investigated, you will notice that differences start to occur. In that, cows fed the lowest DCAD diet prepartum had significantly fewer cows classified as subclinical hypocalcemia. That effect became more pronounced at the 3rd time point and especially at the 4th time point, which was 2 days postpartum. So another key point I want to illustrate to you, if you're going to utilize blood calcium analysis to investigate hypocalcemia on dairy farms, the time point of 2 days postpartum is the most informative time point for us. Taking samples earlier than that can be misleading and truly do not reflect the manipulation of prepartum DCAD and its effect on calcium status. Looking at dry matter intake of these animals, you will notice that there were slight differences in prepartum dry matter intake between the groups. However, and this is a typical response that we see in cows fed negative DCAD diets prepartum, that dry matter intake postpartum is almost always significantly higher than animals fed a non-DCAD diet. The importance of early postpartum dry matter intake cannot be overlooked, because this typically leads to higher milk yields postpartum in cows fed a negative DCAD diet. And this is exactly what we observed in this study. You will notice that the cows fed the low DCAD diet, and again, these were animals that were fed a negative DCAD diet prepartum that resulted in a urine pH of less than 6. They produced significantly more milk through 3 weeks of lactation, upwards of 3.3 kilos per cow per day compared to the control group, and over 2 kilograms of milk compared to the medium DCAD diet. As I mentioned, if you go in the literature and look at the effects of DCAD diets prepartum on early lactation milk yield, there's always almost a positive effect on milk yield when cows are fed a proper negative DCAD diet. So, to summarize very quickly, the adaptation of calcium is influenced by several things. And what I would suggest to you is that cows fed low calcium diets prepartum have to rely on almost exclusively bone resorption to balance her calcium status both prepartum and postpartum. While this may be an effective strategy in reducing clinical milk fever, what we notice in animals fed these strategies is that they typically require much more calcium therapy postpartum than animals fed the second type of diet, and that is diets that are high in calcium and low in DCAD. And by feeding a negative DCAD diet of low DCAD and high dietary calcium, you recruit all the mechanisms that the cow has at its disposal to balance her calcium status. Again, they being calcium that is delivered from bone, calcium that is taken up by gut tissue, and the influence of calcium excretion prepartum on making that system work more effectively. So our recommendations when feeding a negative DCAD diet prepartum for DCAD, length of feeding, and macromineral status is this. Feed to a level of DCAD of -10 to -15, but always check through urine pH analysis that this level of DCAD results in urine pHs below 6. Ideally, our recommended target range is 5.5 to 6. Feed this diet for a minimum of 21 days. Work has shown that the longer that cows are fed a negative DCAD diet prepartum, the better the response. With regards to the dietary formulation of the diet, these macromineral levels are suggested. Feed upwards of 180 to 190 grams of calcium, 53 to 59 grams of magnesium. This is a key nutrient. So always feed elevated levels of magnesium. And 47 to 55 grams of sulfur. In addition, feed 94 to 118 grams of chloride. By feeding macromineral levels within these ranges, you will optimize the performance of cows fed negative DCAD diets. Thank you.